Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something pretty fundamental, actually. Time. But maybe not time as you usually think about it. We're looking at how we measure it in education, how we ration it, and how that rationing, maybe unintentionally, can end up silencing some really brilliant minds. So we've got some source material here that dives into this idea of temporal justice. Our mission for you listening is to unpack why giving what's often called extra time isn't just being nice. It's about equity, especially for a group called Gestalt Language Processors.
Yeah, and we really have to start there with the GLP, the Gestalt Language Processor, because if you don't grasp their specific cognitive rhythm, this whole conversation about time, it just doesn't quite land. For anyone less familiar, GLPs often include autistic or other neurodivergent individuals. They process language in a different way than, say, typical analytic learners. They don't build meaning word by word.
They take it in chunks, right? Whole gestalts.
Exactly. Whole ideas, scripts, entire phrases first, and then they break it down. So that process of synthesizing meaning from the whole, it fundamentally changes how they interact with, the clock. And the thing is, this immediately creates friction with the standard school environment. The school clock, it runs on what our sources call a factory tempo. Learning gets measured like output, delivered at a standard speed.
Like an assembly line.
Pretty much. But deep understanding, especially for a GLP, it unfolds at the speed of coherence when things click internally, not at the speed of the bell. So the core idea we're exploring today is Gestalt time isn't delay, it's depth.
Okay, let's really unpack this Gestalt time then, because it sounds like it applies more broadly than just language, right? The sources describe it as elastic, recursive.
And patient. It doesn't tick along second by second. It moves by readiness. It waits for that coherence to surface. It needs that patience because, as one source puts it rather beautifully, the meaning has not yet exhaled.
That's a great phrase. Not yet exhaled.
Isn't it? It captures that feeling of something needing internal completion.
And the sources stress this isn't just one type of student. It crosses categories.
Absolutely. It could be the quiet child using full scripts from movies or books to navigate social situations, or maybe the artist who thinks in sound or images long before they can articulate it in words.
Or like the student who just lingers on one sentence in a book.
Exactly. Not because they're slow, but because for them, that sentence has not finished speaking. Their internal rhythm just demands that synthesis, that completion, before moving on. Now, contrast that deep, internal, often nonlinear rhythm.
With the school day.
Right. With the pretty brutal external structure of the school system. The sources are quite blunt here. They call it empire time.
Bells instead of breath.
Precisely. 50-minute blocks, 5-minute transitions. It echoes factory shifts. It's about managing bodies in space and measuring productivity.
And that system values speed.
It really does. It grades fluency by speed. So if you're operating on that Gestalt tempo, that necessary pause, that circling back, it almost always gets mislabeled.
How so?
Well, it gets diagnosed as a processing delay, or sometimes it's just dismissed as avoidance or even noncompliance. The clock, which prizes quick output, ends up actively penalizing the mind that needs resonance, that needs depth.
And what happens when you force that rush?
Yeah.
Especially, say, in reading.
The sources warn that something precious collapses. Speed, when it's the main goal, it kills resonance. It turns reading into a kind of chase.
You're hunting for the answer instead of experiencing the text.
Exactly, because for GLPs, meaning isn't just consumed quickly. It has to be metabolized, like digestion. It needs reflection, maybe going back to it.
That time to ripen, you could say.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The time the mind needs to settle the text, integrate the whole big picture before picking apart the details. That's the very window the standard school clock slams shut.
So this friction, it plays out in the actual school bureaucracy, doesn't it? Like with SLDs.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. If you look inside specific learning disability files, SLD files, that's often the classification used in the U.S. You see these descriptions over and over.
What kind of things?
Notes like slow to respond, inconsistent output, difficulty summarizing, things like that.
Okay. Standard deficit language.
Right. But if we put on this Gestalt time lens, we see it differently. These aren't necessarily signs of a fundamental flaw. They're often signs of minds moving by rhythm, not by rule. They're operating on a different timescale.
They're inside the task, maybe.
Exactly. They're circling and listening for coherence that just hasn't clicked into focus yet. They aren't avoiding the work. They're honoring how long it actually takes for them.
But making that distinction, circling versus avoiding that, must be incredibly hard when you're trying to get accommodations.
It's a huge battleground. And the sources point out how frustrating it is because the tools we use, like IEP software, individualized education programs, they just don't have a box to tick for incubation as a skill.
Right. There's no field for knowing grows in spirals.
None at all. And here's the really tough part. To even get that crucial extra time, the student usually has to stumble publicly. They have to fail enough, visibly enough, to prove they need it.
The suffering has to become measurable data.
Basically, yes.
Mhm.
Before the system acknowledges their cognitive landscape might just be different, not deficient.
Okay, but this raises a really important question, doesn't it? How do we make sure this idea of temporal justice doesn't just become an excuse? An excuse for not meeting necessary standards of fluency or output that the real world often demands.
That's a critical point, absolutely. We're talking equity, but rigor still matters. How do you balance that?
Yeah.
Well, the reframing is key. The sources argue that extra time gets talked about like it's mercy or some kind of gift.
Like a special favor.
Right. But if you look at the outcomes, and we'll get to the empirical data in a moment, what it actually does is restore parity. It levels the playing field. So every successful extra time accommodation isn't indulgence. The sources call it an act of temporal justice. It's recognizing that the required cognitive input just takes longer for some people to process fully before they can produce the output. It acknowledges that meaning takes the time it takes.
And there's a human cost to not acknowledging that, isn't there?
Yeah.
The sources mention this ache.
Yes, the ache of having your brilliance constantly mistaken for slowness, of living your life feeling slightly out of phase with the clock, always trying to sync up your internal rhythm with this relentless external timeline. It's exhausting.
Okay, so this isn't just philosophical. There's data to back this up.
There is. And it's important to ground this. The sources point to a really influential 1991 study by Runyan. It was called The Effect of Extra Time on Reading Comprehension Scores for University Students with and Without Learning Disabilities.
Oh, I think I've heard of that one. What did it find?
It provided really strong empirical support for what many educators and Gestalt thinkers kind of knew intuitively. Runyan tracked comprehension scores meticulously, and what they found was when the clock pressure was softened, when students got extended time, understanding deepened significantly. But here's the crucial part. It didn't just inflate grades across the board for everyone equally.
Oh, okay.
Instead, it restored access. It allowed certain learners, particularly those with diagnosed learning differences, to actually demonstrate the knowledge they already had but couldn't show under timed pressure.
So time was the key variable.
Time, not necessarily more remediation or drilling skills, was the factor that closed that comprehension gap in the study. It strongly suggested that for many, the deficit wasn't cognitive, it was temporal.
Wow, okay, so connecting that evidence back to the GLP experience.
It's powerful. It confirms this idea that GLPs are often longer listeners, not inherently slower thinkers. Their cognition is like, well, the sources use the analogy of tidewater.
Tidewater, how simple.
It draws back, gathers weight, allows that space for synthesis, and then returns with something whole, something fully formed. If you rush that tide, you just get fragments. But if you give it room...
It delivers the full wave.
Exactly. So calling it extra time kind of misses the mark. The sources insist it's more like calibration.
Calibration.
Yeah, restoring a more natural human tempo after decades, maybe centuries, of demanding this rigid industrial pacing in schools.
That leads nicely into thinking about silence itself, doesn't it? Because refusing speed often means embracing silence.
It does. And in a system that often equates quick verbal answers with intelligence, silence can feel like resistance or even threatening. There's this pressure to fill the void, to talk, type, prove you're engaged.
Get the assembly line moving.
Right. But for the Gestalt thinker, that silence isn't emptiness. It's essential. It's architecture. It's the resonant chamber where coherence gathers breath, where those complex ideas knit together.
So interrupting it is really disruptive.
Profoundly. The source compares it to cutting a clay pot mid-turn on the wheel. You destroy the form that was emerging. Honoring that pause, that silence, is actually honoring the process of knowing itself.
Okay, so how do we build systems, classrooms, maybe even workplaces that actually honor this tempo? Let's get practical. The sources bring up something called the matristic ethics of care. What's that about?
It's a really interesting ethical framework. The idea is that in so-called matristic cultures, cultures prioritizing relationship, care, community well-being over strict hierarchy or pure output time tends to be more flexible. It bends to the needs of the people and the task.
So rhythm is set by readiness, reciprocity.
Exactly. Not by some external arbitrary clock. Understanding is seen as something that matures communally through cycles, and importantly, through cycles of rest and return.
So how does that translate to a teacher?
Well, the teacher's patience literally becomes the soil for learning. Waiting for an answer isn't seen as wasting time. It's a fundamental act of care. It acknowledges that time is a shared field.
And the slow answer isn't failure.
No, when it finally emerges, it's received as devotion, as a thought that was carefully tended until it felt ready, until it felt safe to come out. That's a massive shift from the anxiety of a timed test, isn't it?
Huge shift. Okay, so philosophically compelling, but how do we actually do this in practice?
Yeah.
How do we align this with things teachers already use, like UDL, Universal Design for Learning, or Vygotsky's ideas? We need specifics.
Agreed. We need actionable principles, not just nice metaphors. The sources distill it down to 3 core principles for academic praxis.
Okay, what are they?
First, begin with quiet. Establish silence not as absence, but as atmospheric readiness. Let the nervous system settle before diving into complex stuff. Maybe start lessons with just a minute of quiet, letting minds fully arrive instead of rushing straight from the hallway buzz.
Okay, start with quiet. Makes sense. What's second?
Second, allow reading to echo. This is key for GLPs. Remember, comprehension often comes before linear decoding or recall for them. So instead of immediately asking what happened next, maybe start with what felt true or what resonated with you.
Get the thematic or emotional gestalt first.
Exactly. Let that surface before you start drilling down into plot points or specific facts.
Okay. Quiet first, then let it echo. And the third principle, I think you mentioned it tackles this stigma around accommodations.
Precisely. Third, use extra time as a norm, not an exception. Design your tests, your assignments, with expanded processing time built in for everyone, or offer untimed options routinely.
So it's not a special add-on just for some kids.
Right. It moves the support from being this visible, sometimes stigmatizing bolt-on for a few students to just being part of the normal, accessible classroom environment, which frankly benefits lots of deep thinkers, not just diagnosed GLPs.
Okay, let's picture this, say an American literature class, high school or college. How does this change things?
Well, instead of marching through the book chapter by chapter, analysis point by analysis point, you recognize that meaning builds through return, through resonance. You read, you pause, maybe you discuss the feeling of it, then you go back days later to analyze structure.
So less linear.
Much less linear. The sources suggest maybe having a shared list of core texts, but letting students choose the order they tackle certain learning goals, like maybe the goals are trace this theme or analyze a rhetoric. The student decides which goal to pursue in which text based on where their understanding is naturally leading them.
And grades. You still need grades.
You do, but the focus shifts. Grades should reflect progress in coherence and advocacy in the final work, the essay, the presentation, whatever it is, rather than just how fast they performed on intermediate quizzes or chapter checks.
So wrapping this up, it sounds like education stripped of this constant rush could actually return to a more natural rhythm.
That's the core idea, a rhythm that honors readiness, that honors relationship, and yes, that honors rest. Silence stops being a deficit. It becomes what it actually is, the invisible architecture of thought, that space where understanding takes shape.
So the goal here for you listening in teaching this tempo and pushing for temporal justice is really about reclaiming learning spaces from the tyranny of speed. It's about restoring the purpose of deep engagement, whether it's with literature or any complex idea, as a genuine dialogue with meaning. It needs that breathing room.
Exactly. And maybe here's a final thought to leave you with. What if we made the frankly radical choice to teach from within that silence sometimes? To consciously honor the shape that waits inside every learner, the idea forming just below the surface. Just consider what real intellectual rigor might look like if we stopped measuring it primarily by velocity, by how fast someone produces an answer, and started measuring it by its fidelity to depth, its coherence. What if the most productive time in your day wasn't the busiest, but the quietest? The time you spent just letting the meaning exhale,